2 American service members are dead. A third is still missing. And within hours before Iran's own military spokesman could even finish drafting a statement, American aircraft were already airborne over Iranian territory for an 8th consecutive night. That is not a rumor circulating on social media. That is the confirmed timeline from USO Central Command itself. On Friday, Iranian ballistic missiles and drones struck a facility in Jordan that hosts American troops and fighter jets. 2 service members were killed in action defending against that attack. A third remains missing. 4 more were medically evacuated to hospitals in Jordan, treated, and have since returned to duty. That single confirmed sentence from Central Command is the reason everything else in this story is happening right now, and it is the reason the tone of this entire campaign just shifted. But that is not even the most important part of what just changed. Read this next detail again, because it is the actual pivot point of this whole story. For the first time in 8 straight nights of American strikes against Iran, Central Command explicitly named the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as the specific target of retaliatory action. Not just Iranian military infrastructure in general, not just coastal facilities or missile storage sites in the abstract, the IRGC forces that launched the attack that killed American troops. That is a different category of statement than anything that has come out of this campaign before. Up until this point, the language from Washington has largely stayed in the register of degrading capability. This time, the word used was punish. And that single word tells you everything about how this fight has just escalated in tone even before you look at a single strike coordinate. Let's back all the way up, because to understand why this specific attack landed as hard as it did, you need to understand what has been building for the better part of 5 months. This war began in the final days of February, when a wave of Iranian drone and missile strikes hit American and Allied military facilities across the region, including inside Jordan itself. Jordanian and American air defenses intercepted the bulk of that opening barrage. A German field camp in eastern Jordan was struck. The American embassy in Amman briefly evacuated non-essential personnel as a precaution. Since that opening week, Jordan has spent months on the receiving end of repeated Iranian missile, drone, and cruise missile attempts night after night, largely turned back by layered air defense. Kuwait has faced an even heavier barrage across this same stretch, with nearly 100 ballistic missiles and close to 300 drones shot down over Kuwaiti soil across the course of this war, alongside American and Kuwaiti casualties from strikes that did get through. This is the backdrop against which Friday's attack has to be read. Not an isolated strike out of nowhere, but the moment when months of near misses against a heavily defended American ally finally produced American dead. Now let's get into the specific numbers of what actually happened, because vague language is exactly what lets a moment like this get flattened into just another headline. On Friday, Iranian ballistic missiles struck Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, a facility that hosts American troops and fighter aircraft. Central Command confirmed 2 service members were killed in action, as U.S. and partner forces defended against the ballistic missile and drone attack. 1 additional service member is currently listed as missing in action. 4 more were medically evacuated to hospitals in Jordan for treatment, and have since been discharged and returned to duty. Central Command has stated it will withhold the identities of the fallen until 24 hours after their next of kin have been notified. Standard protocol for exactly the kind of loss that demands the family hear it before the public does. These 2 deaths bring the total number of American service members killed since this war began to 16. 16 names now attached to a conflict that most of the world still treats as a rolling series of headlines rather than 16 individual families receiving the worst possible knock on their door. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's public response did not hedge or soften. "Godspeed, heroes. Their sacrifice only stiffens our resolve," he wrote in a public statement following the news. That is not diplomatic language designed to manage a news cycle. That is the language of a Pentagon that has just crossed from a campaign of degradation into a campaign that is now explicitly framed, at least in public messaging, around retribution. And this is where the story stops being just about Jordan, because in the same window, Tehran was reported to have targeted Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar as well, with both Kuwait and Bahrain working through the weekend to intercept additional incoming Iranian strikes. Iran did not fire 1 missile at 1 base. Iran opened multiple simultaneous fronts against multiple American partners in the same rolling window, and Jordan is simply the place where the interceptors did not stop everything. Look at what Kuwait alone has absorbed across the full arc of this war, because it puts the Jordan attack into proper context, rather than treating it as an isolated event. Kuwait has been on the receiving end of nearly 100 Iranian ballistic missiles and close to 300 drones since this conflict began, the overwhelming majority intercepted by layered American and Kuwaiti air defense working in tandem. But not everything gets stopped in a fight of that scale and duration. Kuwait has already absorbed its own losses across this campaign, including troops killed and wounded, aircraft damaged, and at least one friendly fire incident during the chaos of coordinated interception under sustained barrage, a grim but familiar reality of any air defense engagement running at this tempo for this long. That is the environment Jordan's own air defenders were operating inside of on Friday night, an environment where even a heavily defended, heavily interconnected regional air defense network cannot guarantee a perfect intercept rate indefinitely, especially when the attacking side is deliberately spreading its salvos across multiple countries at once, specifically to strain that defense across more axes than any single nation can fully cover alone. That regional pattern is exactly why the Jordan attack should be read as part of a coordinated multi-front barrage rather than a single unlucky miss. Spreading ballistic missile and drone attacks across Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar simultaneously is not the behavior of a military trying to minimize casualties or limit escalation. It is the behavior of a military trying to overwhelm layered regional air defense by forcing it to defend everywhere at once, on the theory that spreading interceptor coverage thin enough across enough simultaneous vectors eventually produces exactly the kind of gap that turned deadly in Jordan on Friday. Whether that was the specific tactical intent behind this particular barrage, or simply the latest iteration of a strategy Iran has been running in various forms since February, the outcome is the same, either way. 16 American names now carried by this war, 2 of them added in the most recent 48 hours alone. That brings us to what Central Command actually did in response, and this is where the operational picture gets significant. The United States completed an 8th consecutive night of strikes against Iran in the early hours following the Jordan attack, hitting coastal surveillance sites, air defense positions, and missile and drone storage facilities. But this round was explicitly framed around 2 objectives stated together in the same breath for the first time in this campaign: continuing to degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, and swiftly punishing the specific Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces responsible for the attack that killed American troops in Jordan. Read that pairing again because it matters. The Strait campaign and the retaliation campaign have now been fused into a single stated objective. This is no longer 2 separate stories running in parallel. As of this round of strikes, Washington is treating them as the same fight. Now let's talk about what actually enables a sustained multi-night strike campaign like this one. Because 8 consecutive nights of coordinated strikes against layered Iranian air defenses does not happen with a single aircraft type, flying a single mission profile. It happens through a layered air campaign built around specialization, where different aircraft are handling different pieces of the same problem simultaneously. Electronic attack aircraft go in first, and their entire job is to blind the target's air defense radar network before anything else arrives. These aircraft carry dedicated jamming systems alongside anti-radiation missiles that can either flood an enemy radar frequency with noise until the operator's screen is unreadable, or ride the radar's own emission back to its source and take the site off the air permanently. In practice, a strike package like this often does both at once, against multiple emitters simultaneously, so that by the time the rest of the package arrives over the target, the defending side's radar picture has effectively collapsed into static. That electronic corridor is what makes everything that follows possible. And it is also the part of the mission that almost never makes the highlight reel, because there is no dramatic explosion attached to a radar operator staring at a blank screen. It just quietly determines whether every subsequent aircraft in the package comes home. Behind that electronic corridor comes the precision strike layer, the aircraft handling close-range, high-value targeting against specific buildings, specific command nodes, specific coastal installations that require pinpoint accuracy rather than broad area effect. This is the workhorse tier of the campaign, capable of taking intelligence gathered hours or even days earlier by surveillance assets and translating it into a guided munition landing through a specific window in a specific structure. IRGC headquarters facilities, coastal radar nodes, and maritime capability sites that support the broader Strait of Hormuz denial effort all fall into exactly this category of target, the kind that punishes precision and punishes it severely if you get it wrong. Aircraft in this tier have been flying combat and precision strike missions for decades across multiple regional conflicts, and against an Iranian air defense apparatus that has already been ground down over 7 prior nights of strikes. This is the tier doing the highest volume of the actual target servicing, night after night, methodically working down a list. And then there is the long-range standoff layer, the piece of this equation capable of holding deeply buried, fixed, high-value infrastructure at risk from outside the reach of most air defense systems entirely. A long-range bomber platform of this type does not need to fly through contested airspace to strike deep infrastructure. It can orbit well outside the threat envelope and release long-range cruise missiles that fly low, terrain-hugging routes into the target area, arriving from multiple vectors simultaneously, while the launching aircraft is already turning for home. That is a fundamentally different threat geometry than anything a legacy air defense network built primarily to detect and engage inbound aircraft was ever designed to handle. A network like that can be tuned to look for jets. It is far less prepared to track a dozen or more small, low-flying cruise missiles converging on a single fixed target from a dozen different compass headings at once. Whether that specific, long-range platform has been directly confirmed operating over Iranian airspace on this particular round of strikes has not been independently verified in public reporting as of this writing, but the repositioning of aerial refueling assets deeper into the theater over the past several days is exactly the kind of supporting infrastructure move that would need to happen first, if that capability were about to be brought fully into play. Aerial refueling is not a footnote in modern air campaigns. It is the actual ceiling on how far and how long any strike aircraft can operate. And when tanker assets start moving closer to a fight, it is usually because someone is planning to extend that ceiling significantly. It is also worth noting that whichever long-range platform ultimately proves to be involved, the aircraft itself would likely be older than the organization it is now being used against, a detail that says less about the hardware and more about how long the underlying strategic standoff between these two sides has actually been building beneath the surface of a war that most of the public only started paying attention to 5 months ago. Put those three layers together, and you get the actual doctrine behind a sustained campaign like this one. Blind the network first, deliver precision strikes against the close, high-value targets once the network is blind, hold deep, fixed infrastructure at risk from outside the threat envelope entirely, using standoff range instead of proximity to guarantee survivability. 3 completely different threat vectors arriving against the same target set inside the same operational window, against an air defense network that has already been degraded across 7 prior nights of strikes before this 8th round even began. That is not 3 lucky coincidences stacking on top of each other. That is a deliberate campaign architecture, executing exactly the way that kind of architecture is designed to execute against a layered coastal and inland defense system. One severed link at a time, night after night, until there is very little network left to defend anything. It is worth pausing on just how unevenly matched this specific fight has become by this stage of the war. Iran's air defense planners built their network primarily around the assumption of defending against manned aircraft making relatively predictable approach vectors. What they are now facing, night after night, is a combination of electronic blinding, precision-guided munitions arriving from aircraft that have refined this exact mission profile over decades of continuous combat operations across multiple theaters, and potentially standoff cruise missiles arriving from outside the range of most of their remaining detection systems altogether. Layer 8 consecutive nights of that combination on top of an air defense network that was already operating in a degraded state before this specific war even began. And you start to understand why Iran's public rhetoric has shifted from claims of resilience toward claims about unused capability and new fronts. When a military can no longer credibly claim its existing defenses are holding, the rhetorical fallback becomes promises about capability nobody has seen yet. This is the part that deserves more attention than it has gotten, because it explains why Iran keeps absorbing losses and keeps escalating anyway instead of pulling back. Iran's public rhetoric since the Jordan attack has stayed at a consistently high pitch. Statements attributed to Iran's senior leadership have characterized the American response as a violation of prior understandings between the two sides, warned that the United States would face what was described as unforgettable consequences, and claimed that a significant portion of Iran's military capability has not yet been employed in this conflict, with the suggestion that continued American strikes could open entirely new fronts. Separately, Iran has floated the idea of a ground campaign aimed at seizing American military positions inside Kuwait, a claim that stretches credibility given the air power imbalance already on display across this entire campaign, but a claim that should still be taken seriously as a signal of intent rather than dismissed purely as bluster. A regime willing to say something that operationally implausible out loud is a regime signaling that it believes it has few remaining options left that read as anything other than desperate escalation. Now widen the lens beyond Iran and Jordan for a moment, because this fight is not happening in a vacuum, and the broader global military picture surrounding it matters. In the same rolling window as the Jordan attack and the 8th night of American strikes, Ukraine executed one of the more significant strikes of its own war against Russia, sending close to 400 drones into Russian airspace overnight and hitting logistics infrastructure tied directly to Russia's drone production and supply network, including a major fulfillment and logistics center south of Moscow. Casualties were reported on the ground from that strike, and Russian air defenses reported intercepting the overwhelming majority of the incoming drones across nearly 20 regions, plus occupied Crimea and the surrounding waters, in what was described as the largest single-night drone deployment of that entire war. Ukrainian officials characterized the targeted facilities as tied to the supply of sanctioned components used in Russian drone and navigation equipment production, which, if accurate, would make this less a symbolic strike and more a direct attempt to sever a specific link in Russia's ability to keep manufacturing the exact weapons it has been using against Ukrainian cities for years. None of that changes the specific facts unfolding between the United States and Iran. But it is worth holding in view because it means the current moment is not just one regional flashpoint escalating in isolation. It is one of at least two major simultaneous conflicts, each producing their most significant single-night operations within the same general window on a planet where military attention, intelligence resources, and diplomatic bandwidth are already stretched thin across multiple theaters at once. A world absorbing its largest single-night drone barrage of one war and its most explicitly retaliatory night of strikes in another war within the same 48-hour window is not a coincidence worth ignoring. It is a signal of just how much simultaneous pressure the current global security architecture is being asked to absorb at once, with finite resources and finite attention spread across every one of these fronts at the same time. Let's talk honestly about the internal Iranian picture, because that is the section most surface-level coverage skips in favor of just cataloging explosions. The individuals currently occupying formal government positions inside Iran overwhelmingly rose up through the ranks of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps itself, the same organization now being explicitly named as the target of American retaliatory strikes. That matters because it means the line between Iran's nominal civilian government and the paramilitary organization actually running coastal defense, missile operations, and now apparently the direct planning behind the attack that killed American troops in Jordan is far thinner than official titles suggest. Statements from Iran's senior leadership characterizing the American response as illegitimate or unprovoked have to be read against that backdrop. This is not a civilian government caught in the crossfire of a paramilitary organization's decisions. This is, functionally, the same institutional structure wearing two different uniforms depending on which audience it is addressing that day. The military uniform for internal IRGC audiences and command structures, the formal government suit for international messaging, aimed at framing Iran as the aggrieved party. When Central Command names the IRGC specifically as the object of retaliation, it is effectively naming the actual center of gravity inside Iran's decision-making apparatus, not a peripheral actor operating outside government control. That overlap matters even more once you consider how the IRGC's own institutional incentives shape its appetite for continued escalation. This is an organization with revenue streams, smuggling networks, and coastal trade routes that exist somewhat independently of Iran's formal state budget, and with an internal culture built explicitly around martyrdom rhetoric and resistance as core identity rather than as a means to a negotiated end. A conventional national army facing this level of sustained degradation, 8 consecutive nights of coordinated strikes against its command infrastructure, coastal surveillance, and now explicitly its own leadership-linked facilities, would typically be pushing hard toward off-ramps by this stage. The IRGC's own institutional structure, history, and internal rhetoric point in the opposite direction. This is an organization whose founding mythology is built around outlasting stronger conventional adversaries through attrition and asymmetric resistance rather than through direct confrontation, and an organization that measures a kind of internal legitimacy through its willingness to keep fighting even when the battlefield math clearly does not favor it. That does not mean this specific leadership structure is incapable of eventually seeking a genuine off-ramp. It means the internal incentives pushing against that off-ramp are stronger and more deeply embedded in the organization's own sense of purpose than most external analysis tends to give credit for. There's also a meaningful gap worth naming between what Iran's senior leadership says publicly and what its own forces on the ground can actually deliver operationally. Statements warning of unforgettable consequences and unused capability are cheap to issue and costly to verify. What is not cheap or easily faked is 8 consecutive nights of a degraded air defense network failing to meaningfully slow an opposing air campaign, 16 dead American service members representing losses inflicted rather than losses absorbed and reversed, and the specific naming of IRGC command structure as the direct object of retaliatory strikes rather than a general reference to Iranian military infrastructure. Words and outcomes are diverging here, and that divergence is itself useful information about how much of Iran's public rhetoric right now should be read as genuine remaining strength versus a rhetorical attempt to preserve some semblance of leverage heading into whatever the next several days actually bring. Here is the honest strategic assessment, stripped of the theatrics that tend to surround coverage like this. Iran has now lost 16 American service members worth of restraint from Washington, and restraint is precisely the word that matters here, because the language shift from degradation to explicit punishment signals that the political calculation in Washington has changed. A campaign built around slowly grinding down Iran's coastal denial capability around the Strait of Hormuz is a different kind of campaign, politically and militarily, than one explicitly built around punishing the specific force responsible for American deaths. The former can be sustained indefinitely at a controlled tempo. The latter tends to accelerate because domestic political pressure to demonstrate that American lives were not lost without consequence is a different kind of pressure than pressure to reopen a shipping lane. Watch the target sets over the coming days for exactly this signal. If subsequent strikes continue clustering specifically around IRGC command and leadership-linked facilities, rather than purely coastal and maritime infrastructure, that is confirmation the retaliatory framing is driving targeting decisions now, not just messaging. There's a second signal worth watching alongside the target sets, and that is the pace and tone of American political statements over the coming days. A defense secretary opening with Godspeed heroes language, combined with a president who has spent recent weeks publicly comparing the length of this conflict favorably against multi-year wars and promising the public will see results very shortly, is not the posture of an administration preparing to quietly wind this down after a setback. It is the posture of an administration treating American casualties as a reason to escalate its stated objectives, rather than narrow them. Whether that stated resolve translates into a genuinely expanded target list, deeper strikes against leadership-linked infrastructure specifically, or simply a continuation of the current tempo dressed in more forceful language, is the exact question the next several nights of strikes should answer on their own without needing anyone's interpretation layered on top of it. What happens over the next several days likely hinges on a single unresolved variable more than any other, and it is the one that should genuinely concern anyone tracking this closely. Iran has explicitly stated that a significant portion of its military capability remains unused in this conflict. Whether that is accurate or simply rhetorical posturing from a regime trying to preserve some sense of remaining leverage is genuinely unclear from the outside, and it is exactly the kind of claim that cannot be verified until it either does or does not materialize on the battlefield. But a cornered actor making that specific kind of claim immediately after losing a round of retaliatory strikes explicitly named and targeted at its own paramilitary command structure is a combination that history does not treat kindly. Regimes under this specific combination of pressure, military degradation, stacking on top of direct leadership-linked retaliation, stacking on top of public rhetorical commitments to escalate further, do not reliably de-escalate on a predictable timeline. They sometimes double down specifically because de-escalating in that moment would look, to their own internal audience, indistinguishable from surrender. That is the structural risk sitting underneath this entire chapter of the story. And it is the thing that should actually keep serious analysts awake tonight more than any single strike package. Not the question of whether the United States can continue degrading Iranian capability, because 8 consecutive nights of sustained layered strikes against an already weakened air defense network make clear that capability gap is not in serious doubt. The real question is whether an Iranian leadership structure that just publicly committed itself to opening new fronts, floated a ground incursion into an American partner nation, and is now facing retaliatory strikes explicitly aimed at its own command apparatus, chooses to actually attempt something operationally reckless simply because rhetorical de-escalation has become politically impossible for it to survive internally. That is not a hypothetical for a future news cycle. That is the exact fork in the road this specific week appears to be sitting on. A regime that has spent 5 months absorbing losses without meaningfully reversing them, and that has just watched its own paramilitary command structure become the explicit named target of a superpower's retaliation, has very few remaining paths that do not run through either a genuine, verifiable de-escalation. It has shown no appetite for so far, or an attempt at something dramatic enough to change the narrative for its own internal audience, regardless of whether that attempt is operationally sound. Consider the arithmetic of this war so far, because it tells its own story, independent of any rhetoric from either side. 5 months of sustained American and Allied air operations. 8 consecutive nights of strikes in this most recent phase alone. 16 American service members killed since the war began, a number nobody wanted to see grow, and one that grew again this week. Nearly 100 ballistic missiles and close to 300 drones intercepted over Kuwait alone, with real losses still slipping through that layered defense despite an extraordinary interception rate. An air defense network inside Iran that has been degraded across 7 prior nights of strikes before this 8th round even started. And now, for the first time, an explicit public naming of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as the direct object of American retaliation, rather than a broader reference to Iranian military capability in general. Every one of those numbers points in the same direction. This is not a war trending toward a quiet, negotiated close. It is a war where the stated objectives on the American side have just visibly hardened, and where the rhetorical commitments on the Iranian side have just visibly hardened in response, with very little room left in the middle for either side to climb down without it looking, to their own domestic audiences, like the other side won outright. There's one more thread worth pulling before closing this out, and it concerns the family still waiting tonight for a name to be released. Central Command's decision to withhold identification until 24 hours after next of kin notification is standard, humane protocol, and it exists precisely because a story like this one moves faster across screens and headlines than any family should have to absorb news of this magnitude. But that protocol also means that as this account is being read, there are American households somewhere that do not yet know they are about to become part of this war's growing casualty count in the most permanent way possible. That is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on to the next strike package, the next statement from Tehran, the next repositioning of tankers deeper into the theater. Behind every one of the 16 names accumulated since February is exactly that kind of household. And the fact that this war has now stretched long enough to produce 16 of them is itself part of the story, regardless of which side currently holds the tactical advantage on any given night. Go back to where this specific chapter started. 2 American service members killed defending a base in Jordan. A third still missing tonight. 16 names now carried by this war since it began. Defense Secretary Hegseth's 4 words, "Godspeed heroes, their sacrifice only stiffens our resolve," are already being treated as a signal of exactly how this next phase is going to be fought. 8 nights of strikes have already happened. A 9th is very likely already being planned as this is being written. Whether Iran's leadership responds to a campaign now explicitly aimed at its own command structure with a kind of restraint it has conspicuously failed to show at any previous point in this war, or whether it reaches instead for the new fronts it has publicly promised to open, is the single unresolved question hanging over every American base, every Gulf ally, and every family waiting for a name to finally be released. Nobody outside a very small circle knows that answer tonight. What is certain is that the identities of the fallen have not yet been made public. And somewhere tonight, a family is still waiting for a knock on the door that the rest of the world has already read about in a headline. The strikes will continue regardless of whether that knock has happened yet. The next round is likely already being planned. And whatever comes of it, the arithmetic of this war, 5 months old, 8 nights deep into its latest phase, 16 names heavier than it was in February, will keep being written the same way it has been written every single night so far. 1 confirmed strike, 1 confirmed loss, 1 unresolved question about what happens next at a time.